Everyone to stop what they're doing right now and go read. It's literally 2 pages. Go read A Letter to America. And please come back here and just let me know what you think, because I feel like I'm going through like an existential crisis right now.
This letter, it becomes apparent to me that the actions of 9/11 and those acts committed against the USA and its people were all just the buildup of our government failing other nations in majority of these situations. And this letter was insanely eye-opening. I really urge everybody to Google.
In reading the letter, I could only think of this tweet that I saw the other day. Under settler colonialism, any kind of resistance is branded as terrorist because the only acceptable violence is violence by the occupier.
As I begin this video, allow me to request one thing of everyone who decides to watch. Please leave your opinions about the Israel and Palestine conflict at the door. This video is an attempt to give the heart of some things that are transpiring in our culture with the younger generation, with our political thinking, and also with how the internet has really weakened the sensibilities of a lot of people on very important issues that have civilizational consequences. And of course, that issue today is the praise of Osama bin Laden's letter to America that has swept across TikTok recently. In fact, when this story first came out, I didn't even know if it was worth commenting on. I thought it was simply a trend, just like all the other TikTok trends that happen to have a ridiculous amount of people following them. And then my second conceptualization of this was that, well, this just shows how TikTok is a tyrannical force in society that just makes people weak-minded and makes them say crazy things. But I think both of those characterizations that I initially had, that some of you may also have, were incorrect. They were incorrect because there is a significant push amongst younger people across college campuses in America to basically extol one single side of a very, very long conflict, and by doing that, align themselves with some of the worst people in history. Again, regardless of what you think about the Israel-Palestine conflict, praising Osama bin Laden or thinking that he was some kind of visionary or an insightful person is really something that, in my opinion, should be off limits. It should be off limits to any person that has an ounce of moral decency, clarity, and is capable of separating issues, general issues, from the ramblings and the musings of an evil person. As this bin Laden craze went on, I observed two things that were interesting to me. Number one, there is a great danger in combining relative novelty, a still developing brain, and social media simultaneously. A lot of Gen Zers happen to have absolutely horrible political intuitions because they are being educated, or rather, I should say, miseducated in institutions that have an equally subpar view of the world. Modern American education is essentially not education, it's schooling. And schooling is a euphemism for indoctrination. If you think I'm being a little bit too hyperbolic here, I would encourage you to look at the Progressive Era, look at the writings of Edward B. Cupperley, look at the writings of Woodrow Wilson, of John Dewey. These are the men that actually did a lot to put into motion what is now the modern American education system. And you will find a trend in all of their beliefs. You will find a belief that the pupil, the school child, is not someone who should be educated in universal principles. He's not someone that should be educated in concepts that can apply across generations that will help them build skills. They are someone who should be educated according to the likings of a particular society. They are someone who should be educated in a way, like Cubberley says, that will allow them to be agreeable to the society. And that is the model of education, or rather schooling, that the American public school system has taken. So when you have an entire generation, many of them, not all of them, but many of them being raised under that kind of schooling model where they are indoctrinated to believe that they must be educated in what the society wants, as opposed to what is true and uncontroversial, you will have them reflect some sentiments of that society. That's just how it works. It's unfortunate. You may have them reflect the good sentiments and the bad sentiments, but you could avoid the entire problem if the emphasis was on general learning, reading, writing, math, arithmetic. If Political issues were kept far from the classroom. But during the progressive era, that kind of neutral education was actually chastised and attacked by the progressive reformers who wanted to instill their vision of the world, and their vision of America, and their vision of education, and their philosophy into impressionable kids that by the time they became older were unable to uncouple themselves from those bad ideas, like a terrible relationship that just won't end no matter how much you want it to. But then in the responses to the Gen Z craze, there were a lot of people saying that bin Laden had legitimate grievances. And so my second observation was that a vast majority of political observers fail to understand the manipulative nature of evil. Allow me to take you down a little road here, a little story here, an example, a metaphor. Let me demonstrate this through a metaphor. Let's say you have a serial wife beater who, when he strikes his wife across her cheek, says, "You made me do this because you were so disagreeable." Now, let's assume the wife was disagreeable and is disagreeable. That may be true. She may be disagreeable. She may be mean or nasty or whatever. She may be, she may not be. Who knows? But that does not excuse or justify him striking her across the cheek. But even more than that, his psychotic behavior cannot be divorced from the claim that he made. You see, when you try to analyze the claim someone makes without evaluating their intentions behind making that claim, you will get not a full picture of that claim or not a full picture of what's actually going on. And only in a worldview that tries to separate moral action with personal responsibility, tries to make the individual unaccountable to actually standing account for what they believe, is this ignored. Sure, disagreeable or not, you can't ignore the husband's psychotic behavior. You can't ignore the fact that the husband is using something, using a tool of a language to justify what is unjustifiable. And this is precisely what bin Laden did. In his letter to America, it is true that bin Laden said in one of the first paragraphs that we are attacking you because you attacked us. But guess what? Just because someone makes a statement that you in your position may agree with, that you as an anti-war person or whatever, like I'm anti-war, very anti-war, might agree with, does not mean they become correct, does not mean you sympathize if the person making the statement is themselves someone, a bad actor with bad intentions. A lot of other things in that letter that people just won't quote are much more disagreeable than what bin Laden is alleged to have said. And it shocks the conscience, but you don't see people talking about that particular issue. For example, in his letter, he says a few interesting things, because the letter itself represents several philosophies. Islamist extremism, number one. Religious fanaticism, number two. And obviously, a flawed conception of America. So in the letter, bin Laden is quoted as saying, and he says, why did they attack us in New York? He said, America does not understand the language of manners and principles. So we are addressing it using the language it understands. So he believes that America only understands violence, and so he decided to attack America. Then he says, as for the second question that we want to answer, what are we calling you to, and what do we want from you? He says, the first thing that we are calling you to is Islam. It is to this religion that we call you, the seal of all previous religions. And he goes in to explain why America should devote itself to Islam. He goes in to attack separation of church and state and says that you have to base your beliefs and your laws in America on Islam. He says that you are a nation who, rather than by ruling by the Sharia of Allah in its constitutions and laws, choose to invent your own laws as you will and desire. You separate religion from politics, contradicting the pure nature which affirms absolute authority to the Lord and your Creator. And he goes on and says a bunch of other things. So here's my thing. When a manipulative person uses a non sequitur an argument that does not follow from the previous statement made, to manipulate you. That does not mean you should then ignore everything else and take that non sequitur and run with it. Again, like the example of the husband striking his wife on the cheek. No matter how disagreeable she is, his own psychotic behavior has to be measured in evaluating the statement he made. That's the only way to obtain a true picture of any given thing. I am someone who opposes U.S. interventionism abroad because interventionism rejects the first principle of nationhood. The first principle of nationhood is that a nation, a government, is supposed to be devoted to the ends of ensuring that its own people are okay and that its own borders are maintained. That is the first principle of nationhood. It's national self-preservation, which national sovereignty, which has been eroded by the United Nations and the Atlantic Council and a bunch of these other sort of international organizations, has that sovereignty presupposes national self-preservation. And so that's the principle nations should be devoted to, not this sort of going around the world and trying to instill your own moral order upon the rest of the world doesn't agree with you. So I agree with that. That's something that I think that observers would be well to note. And also, it's also well to note that if you attack foreign countries, no matter the cause, and you do so indiscriminately, and you do so continuously as part of a broader political project. In the case of George Bush, it was to export democracy. That's what the neoconservative rallying cry was of the early 2000s. Then you should expect to breed resentment. These two things are true, but these two things have absolutely nothing to do with what bin Laden was getting at. These two things were simply convenient facts that bin Laden decided to use to justify the unjustifiable and the morally abhorrent, and yet people that already agree with those two things I just mentioned, or people that would say, well, maybe bin Laden was onto something. No, he wasn't onto anything. A con man who speaks to the truth of a particular situation, his con does not become redeemable because he happened to say something that sounds okay. Bin Laden's goal, as I just read to you, was the installation of an Islamic political order in America, the installation of a theocratic dictatorship in America. That was his intention. That was the foundation of the letter. And he buttressed this intention with a false understanding of the American Republic and its desires. And when I think about bin Laden's ideology, I think about the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who also talked about totalitarianism of all sorts. And in her assessment of totalitarianism, Arendt posed two concepts that she found were characteristics of totalitarian regimes. The first concept is the idea of an absolutist ideology. In fact, there was a quote that Arendt said that I think is well for us to read in light of reading bin Laden's stuff. She says, totalitarian regimes exist in a world which itself is non-totalitarian. So in other words, totalitarian regimes are not in harmony with reality. They oppose reality because the world itself is not totalitarian. Reality itself is much more diverse than that. She goes on to say, quote, people are threatened by communist propaganda with missing the train of history, with remaining hopelessly behind their time, and with spending their lives uselessly. In bin Laden's letter, he goes on to talk about how because America did not accept Sharia, it has decided to instead accept homosexuality, fornication, gambling, drinking, and everything that he hates. So what the totalitarian regimes do rhetorically is that, as Arendt says, they try to simplify reality within the frame of their worldview and then connect, and she goes on to say this later, the first causes of particular issues back to their own worldview so as to provide the answer, the solution, and the origin of a particular problem all at the same time. It's a rhetorical manipulation meant to control the minds of the masses and push them towards a particular political aim more than it is an attempt of truth. It's not an attempt of truth. It's actually a complete and utter rebellion against truth, this sort of totalitarian rhetoric. And then the second concept is the concept of the simplified world, where Arendt says that the totalitarians will try to build a simplified way of thinking to increase the plausibility of their ideas. That's what bin Laden was doing. That's precisely what he was doing. He used a bunch of unrelated things tied them into his broader Islamist worldview, and then used the worldview as the ultimate solution and the origin of all of the problems, or lack thereof, that he was talking about. Totalitarians want to manipulate you. Evil wants to manipulate you. And no matter the points that an evil person makes, you should consider those points independently of that person. Because some people will say, well, an evil person said this, maybe they had a point. No, this is a defect in modern minds. The inability to separate the words of someone from who they actually are is a defect of modern minds, just as the inability to understand the intentions behind someone speaking certain words and that connection, and the connection between that and their overall agenda, is also a defect in modern minds. What bin Laden said was simply an attempt to manipulate people. And who is the most manipulated group? Or who is the group that is most capable of being manipulated by bad forces? It's young people. People my age. I'm 23 myself. And I recognize that even my brain is still developing. I'm still trying to learn and get through this world and trying to understand what's going on. Even I can be manipulated by narratives. All of us can be manipulated by narratives. But that's not the important thing. The important thing is that we stand against that by using our powers of reason. And we don't allow the rhetoric of evil to confuse our thinking on matters of serious import. The United States intervening around the world is a matter of serious import, but that has nothing to do with bin Laden's project. That was a convenient excuse used by bin Laden to buttress his absolutist worldview, to buttress his simplified worldview, to destroy the West and destroy America. My last thing is that perhaps Gen Z wouldn't be as susceptible to these lies of manipulation if the United States government had done its job. I think that when the government lies about things, so the government has been lying about our war efforts for the past 20 plus years, and even before that, the government lied about the war on terror, the government lied about a lot of the things. The government didn't tell us that they had funded Saddam Hussein. In the 90s, bin Laden was actually a Mujahideen fighter that was also funded by the CIA. When we know this, to fight against political forces that the government in America didn't like. When the government lies enough, the danger is not that people will believe lies. It's that people won't believe anything. And that'll cause manifestations of either naivete and stupidity in the case of Gen Z, or manifestations of perceived righteousness in the case of all of those who think that because bin Laden called out American interventionism, he somehow has a point. And in both cases, I think both are downstream of a broader culture of lying and deceit that the American government has pushed upon Americans. And it is incumbent upon us as Americans to understand that and to hold ourselves accountable, hold our government accountable, while also holding accountable the rhetoric of evil and not allowing it to have any mainstay or any standing in our civilization. I should also mention that bin Laden also said a lot of virulently anti-Semitic things in his letter as well. So that should be also put on the table. My friends, reject the rhetoric of evil. Don't allow plausibility to guide your mind towards conclusions that it does not merit. And most importantly, my friends, understand that not everything in this world is as it seems, and some people are very manipulative. And sometimes the evilest amongst us will appear as angels of light to convince you of their virtue, when in all reality, they have nothing but darkness and vice in their hearts. My friends, like this video, comment on this video, share this video, subscribe to this channel. If you want to support me, donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, my locals, my Buy Me a Coffee. All that is in the comment section down below. Like this video, please. My friends, study history, study philosophy. But most importantly, please, you better stay pensive. Bye, guys.